that file in the next few minutes. Adrian, I believe, is not going to be with us today, so I'll go ahead and facilitate today's meeting. I'm going to indicate the start time as 1:33. Do we plan to take roll today? Do we bring a listing? I didn't.
No.
So we didn't have anything other than minutes to vote on.
Yeah, typically, at least what we happen to me, what always comes to is either popcorn around or cheap.
Okay. So we're going to skip roll call when we do a vote for the meeting minutes. We'll just ask that one person per agency identify themselves and give the vote on behalf of their organization. But let's go around the room and do welcome and introductions. I know there's probably a few people here that I've not met, and also I am newly returning to the Office of Homelessness. I'm Jeff Herron, and I previously served as the Continuum of Care Coordinator from 2018 through the end of 2021. And as of last week, I have returned to the office as the new manager. And so I'm very excited to return to the office and to this work, and very excited to get to know those of you that I've not worked with previously. But definitely just kind of hand it off to Marissa and we can go around the room. Just let us know who you are and what organization that you're with.
Hello, everyone. I am Marissa Webb, and I'm the Continuum of Care Coordinator.
I am Amy Crow. I'm the VA Homeless Outreach.
Hi, I'm Joy Andrade, and I'm with the HPI board.
I'm Bruce Davis, member of the HPI board.
I'm Brian Geider. First time here, I'm with Independence Place.
I'm Alicia Buras at Volunteers of America Mid-States.
I'm Erica Dominguez with the Lexington Rescue Mission.
Marty Jones with the Community Action Council.
Chris Lansford with Street Outreach, Lexington Rescue Mission.
Chris Clark, Community Action Council, Street Outreach, HPI Board.
Rachel Hamilton, Natalie Sisters.
Julie Joseph, NAMI Lexington.
Christina Ellison, Music Innings Bluegrass.
Naomi Fluid, Lexington Public Library.
Jamie Cody, Bluegrass Care Navigators.
Janelle McConnell-Carson, Lexington Homelessness.
David Shadd, Hope Center.
Joseph Williams, Lexington Police, representing the Downtown Entertainment District.
Eddie Thurman, the Lexington Police Department. I'm the Neighborhood Resource Officer and the Homeless Liaison.
All right, thank you, everyone. So we'll go ahead, and the first item on the agenda is the approval of the meeting minutes from the June 22nd meeting. Do I have a motion for approval of the minutes?
So moved.
Is there any discussion? Is there a second?
Second.
All right. The minutes are approved. Next, moving on to new business. Our first item is going to be emergency shelter standards, and Marissa is going to start us off.
Hello, everyone. So, from my understanding, there were standards that were already created and established for the rapid rehousing program, as well as beginning to be underway for permanent supportive housing programs. So now we are moving right along to emergency shelter standards. The goal of these standards is to set a minimum of what the continuum, for lack of a better word, standard is for all emergency shelters. So not necessarily a comprehensive rule and guidance, but really the baseline for what individuals coming through our emergency shelters, what they can expect, and what employees for emergency shelters are to, what kind of care they are to provide for individuals in our emergency shelters. So if you are interested in specifically being a part of setting up those shelters, please let me know here. I will also be reaching out to all of our emergency shelters for their input And this will be standards that we create together, and then will be approved by the continuum. So if any individuals want to be a part of that or were previously a part of some of those other setting of standards, please let me know.
So similar to the way we developed rapid rehousing standards, I think it would be helpful for us to start with a work group. We would definitely want representation from each of our emergency shelter providers. So if those of you that operate shelter programs want to go ahead and volunteer yourself or someone from your organization, for those not present, we'll definitely follow up with them. But just getting a group and convening them together so that we can work on developing a draft together. Those of you that went through the process with rapid rehousing and the process that's underway for permanent supportive housing know that there's a lot of back and forth. We're going to be working with programs that, even though they might provide a similar service, they might be operating on different funding sources, have different populations, and just a lot of different aspects that we might need to consider in developing a kind of baseline for our overall shelter component. So any of the shelter providers want to go ahead and Marty for CAC, and David, you want to do it for Hope Center?
I will do it for Hope Center.
A little bit different than want to. Earlier this week, somebody asked me if I had time for something. I was like, have time? Maybe not. Make time short. All right. So we'll follow up with other shelter providers. Is there anybody else that wants to participate in that group? All right, then we can move to the next item on our agenda. So we have Janelle Parsons with us from Untold Content, who you may be familiar with as doing the marketing and branding for the Lexington Homelessness Continuum of Care. They're here today to talk to us about the Community Voices Project. This ties in with the lived experience stories that we have had living on the COC website. We're kind of just taking it to the next phase or level. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn that over to Janelle so she can tell us a little bit more.
Yeah, thank you all so much for having me today. I think you mostly said it all, Jeff. I'm here with the Community Voices Project today. Like before, we're looking to tell stories from folks currently experiencing homelessness. So if there's someone that would like to share their story that y'all can connect me to, that would be amazing. As we push the project forward, we're also looking to feature like success stories from folks working in the community to end homeless. So if your organization, you know, something's gone really well recently, there's a story that you would like to talk to me about so that we can get it up on the website, we'd also be interested in that. I do have my contact info over here if anyone would like to grab that from me before we go. I don't know if anyone has any questions, but that's kind of my spiel.
So another thing that I'll kind of just add to that is we're currently going through the process of applying for the supplemental NOFO to address unsheltered homelessness. That process requires us to incorporate those with lived experience into our overall process of how we're going to identify projects, how we're going to operate them, how we're going to evaluate them. So I think this is just a really good opportunity for us to focus on capitalizing on the experience of those who actually live day to day what we are here to try to alleviate and try to address. They have a lot of valuable experience to provide, and as Janelle explained it, my understanding, we're also interested in hearing from service providers. If you want to share what your experience has been working in this field, if you have any great success stories, any reflections on the time that you've worked within this field, that's just as valuable in a lot of ways to sharing with the general public and the Lexington community as a whole to better inform them about the issues and about the work that we're doing. So if anybody wants to, definitely feel free to reach out to Janelle to get her contact information. What's the best way for folks to reach you? Is it probably going to be email?
Yep, I'm Janelle, Jannell, @untoldcontent.com.
we will also send that information out via our listserv. We just want to invite Janelle here today to meet with you, put a face with a name, and go ahead and facilitate some introductions. Does anybody have any questions for Janelle? We're a talkative group today. So I am due to give the update to council for the office in early September. This presentation will go to Jennifer Sutton next week, but I was to present this to the board by today. I apologize about my inability to get this presentation to you in advance of today's meeting. I plan to circulate this to the board via email after today's presentation additionally, as well as reviewing it here today. But really just want to give the opportunity for you all to get the update that we intend to give and also give any feedback. The other thing that I'm going to ask that you kind of give me a little bit of forgiveness on is I had a root canal about 2 hours ago. So if I'm not talking very clearly, then just please overlook it. Doing my best to just power through. All right. So we're going to start by just talking a little bit about the history of the office. As most of you in the room probably know, the office was created in 2014. That was the direct result of then Mayor Jim Gray forming a community task force who developed the 2013 Greater Good Report. That report had 44 original recommendations for addressing homelessness in the Lexington community. And for the most part, we've accomplished nearly all of those recommendations. So 31 of the recommendations were completed and are now closed. And then 11 others we consider to be closed or completed but ongoing. So for example, that would be things like NAMI's mental health court, the medical respite program. Those are recommendations that we have incorporated into our ongoing process to address homelessness. They weren't simply like one-time or short-term measures. And there were only 2 of those recommendations that we actually deferred. Those largely had to do with things like lobbying for policy change, and as a government office, that really didn't feel like the right fit for us. So we passed or deferred those recommendations onto other advocacy groups to pursue. Next, just a little update on what we have invested in the homeless system here in Lexington. I'm going to go ahead and give you a note as to what this would include. So for the most part, this will not include funds that are administered by the Division of Grants and Special Programs, such as the Emergency Solutions Grant, except for the CARES Act funding. The reason for that goes along with the next caveat, which is this is going to largely represent solely funding that was administered, implemented, overseen, or in some other way led by the Office of Homelessness Prevention and Intervention. This office had a much more direct hand in facilitating who received CARES Act funding, which projects were selected, how we chose as a community to prepare and respond to the coronavirus pandemic. So that we did include. Once we look at it just from that snapshot, this wouldn't again include things like general fund dollars. We have over $37 million that's been invested in our homeless response system since the office was created in 2014. We can look at that by both funding source and by purpose. And one thing that I intend to really kind of address when we give this update to council is specifically in looking at the funding by purpose. So a national best standard would be that we should ideally be investing in at least 4 different permanent housing opportunities in our community for every 1 emergency shelter bed, or a 1-to-4 spending ratio. And as you can see here, we don't necessarily have that split that we would want. We have some pretty significant investments in ending homelessness, but we still as a community are investing a lot of money in managing homelessness, and we should really see those numbers eventually flip to where we have much more on the ending homelessness side. Emergency shelter, emergency solutions to address homelessness definitely have a place. They're needed. They're very important and critical as a part of our overall system. However, we want to make sure that we give longer term solutions to individuals. Emergency shelter in and of itself is not always going to be able to end someone's homelessness. So we have to make sure that there's options available for persons once they would exit our emergency system and move on. Next, just going to highlight some of the achievements that those investments have allowed us to make as a community. So in 2019, our community achieved the usage designation for effectively ending veteran homelessness. And thanks to the hard work of our veterans partners like the VA and Volunteers of America, we still maintain that designation today. We additionally have come into compliance with HUD regulations, and this involves things like building a coordinated entry system to connect individuals that are experiencing literal homelessness with housing resources in a way that is standardized and objective and prioritizes those who are most in need. The office also became the lead for our Homeless Management Information System, or HMIS. Prior to the office existing here in Lexington, we did not have local HMIS support. All of that came out of the state level at Kentucky Housing Corporation. They do amazing work and they are amazing partners, but there's been a lot of great opportunities that have been facilitated by us having an HMIS lead here in our community. It's allowed us to really do a lot of additional dives into our data to see what it tells us about our performance and our needs and gaps. And I think it also just makes it a little bit easier for our partners to get the support that they need around a system that can be, admittedly, not always the most easy or user-friendly. And along with that, we've had a huge expansion with participation in our HMIS system. When I would have stepped into my role, I know about a year ago I did a presentation and we would have had maybe around 30 or so end users in the COC, and by the time I left that position we were carrying about 100 end user licenses, and that also incorporates at least 11 additional agencies that came into our HMIS system in approximately the last year. We've also been able to utilize funding to develop innovative programming. So a lot of the funding on the previous slide that was identified as LFUCG funds comes from the Innovative and Sustainable Solutions to End Homelessness Fund, which was created by ordinance and is an annual commitment to our homeless system. Those funds are intended to be used for pilot programs, for programming that is considered to be innovative or new ideals, and it's not intended to be sustainable. So typically those are going to be limited to somewhere between 1 to 3 year pilot projects. But they allow us to try a lot of things, best practices and models that we can incorporate from other communities and see how they actually impact our local system. And if it's something that we want to continue, then we have some time to work on developing sustainable funding for those programs. We've been able to implement at least 50 new programs because of that fund. Additionally, we coordinated a comprehensive and effective response plan to a historical global pandemic. Thanks to the amazing partners that we have in this room, we were able to come together very early on in coronavirus and develop a very sound plan that allowed us to carry through without some of the more negative impacts that we saw in other communities. And we have greatly increased the participation and the diversity of our COC partners, now carrying over 75 different member organizations, up from 16 in 2014. And we've also managed to increase our federal funding, even after a small decrease that we would have seen in last year, the first competitive round that we had since coronavirus. We're still at 35% increase from where we were in 2015. In several years, we've also achieved receiving over the amount of funding that we asked, including in 2018 and in 2020, when we had roughly 102% of our ask funded. Next, we're just going to take a quick look at some Lex Count Statistics. This is one of the primary measures. Even though it's a snapshot on one particular day, it does give us some information about our overall trends and our effectiveness and our progress towards ending homelessness locally. We've had roughly a 54% decrease in homelessness since the office was created in 2014. Obviously, we have to acknowledge that there was a slight increase over 2021. A couple of things to keep in mind when we look at that increase, however. One thing would be in 2021, we did not conduct a street count, and HUD, whenever we do not conduct a street count, they would use the numbers from the previous year in place of us not having an actual street count conducted that year. So that number does incorporate the number of unsheltered persons that we had in 2020. For us as a community, that was actually probably a fairly good assessment of our unsheltered population because we had some pretty severe weather that year. And so we expect that the majority of our population would have attempted to access shelter on the evening of our 2021 count. But you know, we can't say with definitive accuracy exactly what the number would have been in 2021 just because of all the regulations we had to meet from HUD in order to conduct safely a street count that year. So that puts us closer to our numbers from 2019, but still some good progress. However, I would say that 715 Lexingtonians on our streets is still too many, and we need to do better work and keep moving forward. So now that we've completed the recommendations that came out of the Greater Good Report, we have, as of January 2021, been working under our updated 5-year strategic plan to end homelessness. The Office of Homelessness Prevention and Intervention partnered with Rick McQuady's Office of Affordable Housing and shared the cost of that strategic plan. Because obviously those two missions go hand in hand. We really can't effectively end homelessness without also addressing the affordable housing crisis that we have within our community. This updated plan includes 55 different recommendations or action steps and is organized into 5 overall overarching goals. That would be community outreach and engagement, preventing homelessness, policy and advocacy, funding sources, and expanding permanent supportive housing. A look at some of the content that would be within each of those areas and some kind of rough dollar amounts to help us understand what kind of investment is needed to achieve those goals. For example, under community outreach and engagement, this is some of the earlier stuff in the timeline for our strategic plan. As we view ending homelessness really as a community problem that requires a community solution, this is one of the strategies that we are employing to kind of broaden the base of stakeholders that we have wrapped around this mission, and to make sure that we are operating in a way that is transparent and objective and incorporates feedback and ideals from persons in all different areas of life. Another major thing in this area is the development of an onboarding curriculum for case managers. Our direct service providers know how challenging it can be to recruit, but also to maintain good staff. We tend to lose a lot of people to higher paying jobs in other fields, and we also lose a lot of people to things like burnout. So this is a strategy to really make sure that we're setting our frontline staff up for success and giving them the tools that they need. It would be the intent that this onboarding curriculum will take a little bit of the burden off of your individual agency to train the frontline worker on all aspects of their job. You can maybe allow them to learn a little bit about things like what resources and organizations do we have within the community, what do they do, how do you connect clients with those resources. So you can kind of focus on the things that you need to orient your staff to, just in becoming oriented to your organization, your policies, and not necessarily have to train them on the entire field of social services. It's really intended to just kind of supplement the work that you're already doing internally. Additionally, some of the resources, some of the recommendations we've not made as much progress on, but I'm hoping that we can continue to work forward, is in the area of preventing homelessness and development of things like diversion and mediation programs. Right now, we are still operating the Housing Stabilization Program on ERAP funding. And so that's really something that we've learned a lot as a community in all of the thousands of households that have accessed that rental assistance. I'm sure Marty could give you a much better idea of those numbers than I could, but it's a lot, and that money is going out the door quickly. They've done a great job of facilitating that program. It's something that we've never had an eviction prevention program at that scale before, and there's a lot of lessons learned, and there's a lot of different components and players that have been identified. This is a great opportunity for us to take that momentum and channel it into an eviction prevention program that would be long-term and would not be specific to addressing the effects of coronavirus. There are several action steps like the engagement of local lawmakers, as well as leverage of the Chamber of Commerce and their support that really would have no additional cost to the system. As such, those are going to be some of the things that I hope that we can focus on in the next year or two as we work on trying to identify additional sources of funding. I think that's a good way that we can do some things that really don't cost us a lot, but would have a lot of impact in getting to our end goals. And towards the end of the plan, you're going to see the expansion of permanent supportive housing units. Part of the reason that this is a little bit later in our strategic plan is because of all the things that have to happen first. We have to get those lawmakers involved. We have to make those policy changes. We have to identify those funding sources before we're really able to do the hard work of actually generating those permanent housing units. Finally, we're going to take a look at some of the recommendations that we have already done work towards. We have the centralized public education campaign, as well as the onboarding curriculum for case managers. We have completed all of the action steps or are completing them ongoing. For some of them, in terms of our public education campaign, we had a first initial campaign with Untold content that really helped us to identify the Lexington homelessness brand and carve that out. That involved the rollout of the new COC website, our public-facing data dashboard. And because of the success of that initial phase, we now have a new contract with Untold to kind of move things to the next level. And as I mentioned, we are working on that onboarding curriculum. That RFP went out to bid. It's been now under contract. That's also going to be with Untold content. They have identified some strategic partners to bring into that project, and we're currently developing that content, and there's about roughly a 2-year timeline for that to be released to the public. We're also currently working with Untold content in the area of expanding the access and use of our public data dashboard. So last fall, we were able to roll out our initial data dashboard, and it's a great foundation or a great base for us. What we're kind of looking to do next is to move it forward to another level where it would be perhaps a little bit more user-friendly, maybe a little bit more dynamic, and really something that would be accessible to anyone, whether that be a council member or a journalist or just an average citizen who wants to know more about our community, the work that we're doing, and our progress on our key indicators. So just kind of recapping, I've listed some of the items that we've already made significant progress on and some of the items that we're going to try to focus on as we move forward in this plan. But at this time, I'm totally open to questions or if anybody would have any feedback before we would take the presentation to council.
If on the numbers you had for homeless, about the number of experiencing homelessness, was that unsheltered and sheltered or just unsheltered?
So These numbers?
Yeah, those numbers.
Yeah, so it's kind of hard to see with the lighting, but this is going to include, this is our overall numbers. It doesn't have a breakdown by sheltered and unsheltered. The breakdowns are going to be by like families, individuals, children, and total persons.
Okay, so okay.
Yeah.
So the blue line's the total.
So the blue line is the total. Yeah, and then the red, which is going to be the easiest to kind of see, is going to be our single individuals. The blue is going to be persons and families, and then the green bar is children identified in our counts.
I've always wondered this, but I feel free to ask this question now.
Yeah.
Has it ever been thought in the presentations and to acknowledge that that huge drop was largely attributed to redefinition of who was counted in the homeless count? So it doesn't look like we have stopped working, but really it was really HUD trying to line up with HUD's definition. So we counted transitional housing, permanent supported housing before, and we don't.
Yeah, so I'm thinking it's probably fairly public knowledge that there is some considerations that we have to make, particularly in this earlier part. We still have continued, even after that change occurred, to make progress, but the first couple of years that are incorporated here, what Janice is alluding to is that there were some changes as to both by HUD regulations and even locally who was counted as homeless on the evening of the count. For example, I remember way back in the day when Chicky was the COC lead, sometimes in addition to doing things like a count in our shelters, we did the street count in different ways. I remember at least one year we, for example, interviewed persons at the transit center and asked them to identify whether they were homeless or not. And obviously if we just go to the average person, we all know that there are thousands of different definitions that are employed, even by the federal government. There's a variety of definitions that are used. Our definition is not the same definition as the school system. Additionally, a lot of transitional housing programs were originally counted in those earlier numbers, and they are no longer counted now. So that alone would account for a drop of at least a couple of hundred. Without me looking at the numbers further, I can easily say that. And there are some programs that we as a community took a more detailed look at to really consider whether they met the definition that we employ of literal homelessness or not. So that's definitely a factor. We can't attribute 100% of the success and the decrease to the creation of the office or to any other particular aspect of our system. Definitely something to keep in mind, but I think I want to say it was around 2016 that we actually saw that change. I'll research that and follow up on that just so we all have a good sense of where that occurred. But even still, you see that we continue to make progress, and now we're kind of at the point where we're going up and down a little bit, and that change is not as significant. So at this point, we're a little bit closer to maintaining than decreasing. So how do we take it and push it a little bit further? How do we continue to decrease this number, and not by simply changing the definition of who we serve? So I think that's a really extremely valuable point to make. Other questions or feedback for our council update?
The people I work with, the people in different organizations always say, like, the ratio I believe you said was 1 to 3 or whatever for the temporary versus permanent housing.
Yeah,
it seems like that should be reversed, because everybody always wonders why money is spent on temporary when money is gone. We end up with people that are right back out homeless again in the province. So why not flip those numbers around? What's the point in doing the temporary?
So that's a really valid point. So the point being made is that, we spoke earlier about that ideally we would have like a 1 to 4 ratio for every emergency shelter bed. We would then turn around and fund 4 permanent supportive housing beds. Why aren't we there? At least some of that I could potentially speak to. One thing is making sure that you and the broader Lexington community are going to their elected officials and advocating specifically for the creation of permanent housing. We have people who are in positions that can make change, and they're probably well-intentioned, But sometimes we choose to invest in emergency shelter, which again plays a role, but sometimes it doesn't get someone permanently housed. So especially when we're talking about programs that may be time limited, we need to make sure that there are clear options for persons once they would exit or roll off of those programs. Other things, would just be kind of, I think a lot of times, people that don't live this work, that don't do it every day, might not necessarily keep up with a lot of trends or best practices, and so they may not be familiar and may kind of fall back on kind of the tried solutions that we're familiar with, and that might be a part of it too, is that maybe the general public just kind of equates homelessness with, oh, we need more emergency shelter. A lot of times when Marissa and I get calls from the office, that's one of the first things that people want to talk about is, well, we must need more funding for emergency shelter because I saw this individual on the street. Well, there are other reasons that someone might be on the street. It might not be the availability of emergency shelter beds. And in fact, several of these years, like in 2020 and in 2021, we had more emergency shelter beds that went unutilized. We could have housed more individuals in emergency shelter on the evenings of those counts. We had the emergency shelter beds available. People were choosing not to, or for some reason were unable to access those beds. And that indicates to me that maybe we need to shift a little bit of our priorities in terms of what we're funding. Other thoughts? Like I said, I will circulate the presentation to the board, and we're going to be getting it to Jennifer Sutton with Vice Mayor Kay next week. So if there are any thoughts or anything that we might want to include, update, revise, definitely feel free to get that feedback to us because we have a few days to turn that around.
Jeff, what I was thinking about, under goals and objectives, it mentioned that Lexington Homelessness Fund at the Bluegrass Community Foundation, and had a figure in there, $120,000 annually. Is that under like a goal to raise that much through that fund each year, or is that just to be able to spend that much, or both, I guess?
A lot of the recommendations around that involved hiring a dedicated consultant to work on the fund, someone who has experience and knowledge in developing capital funds. And so far, that's something that hasn't occurred. Definitely that's something that we can explore, but there is some cost associated with identifying and hiring such a person, and then some of the ongoing costs that sometimes it takes a little money to raise money. So that's kind of where we get to a dollar figure that seems a little bit steep, but that was outlined much more comprehensively within the strategic plan, and a lot of those action steps we kind of check off like the first action step in that area, and then after that, because we didn't have funding for a position, we haven't hired someone, all the rest of those objectives are currently unmet.
So that figures are really an objective or goal.
Yeah.
Too. Thank you.
And that's kind of, I think that's the original estimated cost that was provided by Analytic Insight when they developed our plan. They looked at some of the other communities that have taken steps like that and gave kind of some baseline cost for the position and the activities. All right, then moving along. Since Adrian's not here, it looks like I would be up next again.
You picked the wrong day to eat a root canal, so
I sure did.
Bless your heart.
So, the subject of the COC Executive Committee. In the last board meeting in July, Polly had recommended and the membership voted that we should add 4 additional members to represent the continuum of care, to bring us back into full compliance with HUD around the composition of our board and how individuals are appointed. The challenge that I have had in the last couple of weeks is stepping into this role and sitting down to revise our governance charter I didn't necessarily have all the information or all the pieces that I needed to take that from what sounds like a very simple ideal and translate it into our process. As I worked to revise that document, it got very messy trying to separate out the HPI board from those who are represented by and voted in by the continuum, and how we basically run two different sets of, for example, policies around how individuals are appointed to the board. And I just needed to do a little bit more homework. As I kind of reached out to some individuals, I found that maybe we weren't fully there yet. There are some potential legal complications that I need to work with our law department on. I need to further review this with Commissioner Lanter and get his support and his understanding. So I have more work to do. I just unfortunately could not turn it around that quickly without more lead time. I know that this is something that Polly had recommended that we do for the COC competition. What I can say is we've submitted our governance charter as an attachment every year, and HUD has never identified the issue of our board being mayor appointed. So I'm going to hope that it stays buried in those attachments, and this is not the year that we lose points for that, because we really don't want to lose any points. But I would rather, if we're going to make a change, take the time and slow down and make sure we're doing it the correct way. I still want to pursue it, but I want to make sure that we would revise that governance charter in a way that is clear, that everyone knows how we're actually operating, that there's not confusion, that we know exactly what it is that we're doing, and we can soundly say that we've done it with the best approach. So this time we're going to keep moving forward and having those conversations, but I just wanted to update you that I do not feel like it's feasible to execute that prior to submitting our COC application. It would have to have been fully prepared and presented in this committee and then voted by the board in September, and we didn't even have a complete working draft. We had some revisions that were made, and I just, in good faith, I really can't push that forward. So I'm glad if there's any questions or discussion around it, but my main intent today was to provide you with that update.
Do you feel it's going to remain a mayor-appointed board?
So what Polly had advised was that we would keep the HPI board and it would remain mayor-appointed. There's several reasons for that. One thing being that that gives us things like the representation from council members. It allows us to still have a lot of the resources that LFUCG has, and a lot of the infrastructure in order to be able to carry out things. But that we would simply add those 4 additional members, and that essentially we would have an agenda that would be split. The way that Polly envisioned it would be that we would have the HPI board is specifically supposed to oversee the activities around the Innovative and Sustainable Solutions Fund. And so we would have a portion of the agenda that would be specifically for items related to that fund. So that's going to be things that would be, you know, like currently we're funding the match for our Continuum of Care coordinator position. We're funding our HMIS subsidies to providers, and then we're doing some of those pilot programs out of that fund. And the HPI board would continue to vote on those items and oversee the activities of the fund. And then there would be an additional portion of each agenda that would be general Continuum of Care matters. And those 4 additional members would vote on those issues, and only the HPI board would vote when it came to the Innovative and Sustainable Solutions Fund. So what it essentially would do is just expand the representation of the board. It would keep us in compliance with having members who were appointed by the membership, and it would also kind of change to some extent the dynamics of the vote. There would be a little bit more provider influence, and we would also be trying to target probably 2 persons with lived experience to have greater representation for those that have lived experience on the board and in the decision-making process, which is going to make
those
us...
4 would not be mayor
that?
appointed.
Those 4 would not be. They would be
mayor appointed.
Nominated and voted on by the membership of the COC. And I've seen something in KHC's governance that looks like it's kind of similar in how they have some different levels of board members. So I think it's feasible. I think we just need to do a little bit more research and not, for lack of a better term, slap it together because we want to include it in the application.
Yeah, you know, when that discussion, Marty, you were in that discussion too. One other option that was offered or suggested was that the COC be able, it's kind of like NASW does this too. You put forward members that you would want to be nominated so that the COC would have a role in it, and they would put forward names, and those would go maybe to the mayor, and the mayor would select the candidate. So they thought that would fulfill. Do you remember that, Marty?
Yeah.
So that might be an easier process, you know. So.
Yeah, and who's doing that?
Well, like I'm just talking about, NASW does that. They ask from the membership somebody they might like to be nominated to the licensure board, and they put forward names. A lot of states do that, but that was one of the alternatives that was discussed when we were on the call with KHC and Louisville.
I'm definitely open to whatever ideals there are for this approach. I definitely want us to, A, be in compliance, but B, I want everyone that is a member of this continuum to feel like they have a role, like their voice is heard. I think the OP plays a great role in what we do can be complicated. With all of its acronyms, all of the different measures, all of the different regulations, it's important to have people that have the ability to really take a look at that information, to live it, to breathe it, to dive into it, do it daily, and give recommendations. But ultimately, this membership should be part of our decision-making process, and I think we still have that to some extent. You know, we have operated in a way where things come out of our committees, where the full membership votes on anything before it goes to our board. So I think we can definitely point to how we include the membership, but I don't think that there's necessarily one pathway. And so I'm glad to hear of this. I'm glad to revisit the subject, even though the board previously voted. You know, I don't know how many options were presented or how things were presented. So to me, it's an ongoing conversation. I'm prepared to move it forward, but I'm also prepared to adjust what the end goal or picture would look like.
So will there be a strategic implementation for the actual HPI board to make sure there's certain representation from different sectors? I mean, I know that was done years ago before we even became a board.
In our existing governance
outside
charter,
of the 4 additional.
Now, in terms of those 4 individuals, I know just from notes that Polly left that she was hoping that at least 2 of those persons would be persons with lived experience, but I don't know that there was further targeting of different representation. I think that would be a discussion for this body to determine what are our priorities if we were to pursue the path of identifying 4 additional members, or if we were to go a different route, if we were to do something where we were maybe having the membership somehow nominate or vet those candidates. Either way, you know, what do we want to target? What do we think who needs to be at the table, I guess?
Beyond the HPI, but the board members, are they going to be strategic, like to make sure we have certain representation, like so many council members or so many nonprofits or so many? I can't remember.
In our existing governance charter,
so
and
that would
bylaws,
stay
like,
existing,
we have to
and these
have
would be
2
4
council
additional
members. We target you're on our board because of being the only organization that serves domestic violence survivors.
But I roll off in September, so. I leave in September, so I'm trying to figure out, do I need to make sure I have somebody to replace me because it's TV?
Yes.
Okay.
And my understanding was that probably that would be somebody else from your organization.
Okay.
Since we only have one domestic violence provider in the area. I think Polly had mentioned that potentially maybe Diane might be interested in serving in your place when you go along. You and I are going to have to quickly have some discussions about that.
I actually spoke to one of your peers about like how to potentially apply as well.
Well, I was going to have Diane Fleet do it. I think that's just the way we were going to do it. I didn't know if there was going to be any kind of change I needed to be aware of before we
to my
move
knowledge,
forward.
I would like to keep that structure unless anyone's opposed to it. I think that it really does help us to diversify, make sure that we're looking at, homelessness is really multifaceted, and we need to make sure that what works for one aspect of our population, that we're considering it from other angles, and that we're not unintentionally doing things that might be short-sighted. We also have representation from at least one emergency shelter provider. Can you think of any of the other targets offhand? I know there are several of them. There's one for HIV/AIDS. So we have that, and I would think we would want to keep it. Bruce has got his manual, I think.
I think this is under a little knowledge. It's a dangerous thing. You remember, what was it, about 3 years ago now, before this godforsaken pandemic got started, Polly and you held some workshops for the board. We know the ordinance and everything. And I wanted to ask, there's the ordinance that created this board. Is that correct? Passed by the Urban Council.
Yes.
And then there's the governance charter for the COC that it's just passed by the board.
Correct.
It wasn't a Urban County Council pace, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. So, under...
and that's because our board is presently dual.
Right.
It is the HPI board, and it's also our COC board. Right. So there are the bylaws and the ordinance which govern the HPI board, and then the COC governance.
Right. Under the ordinance that was passed by the Urban County Council, it has, the 2 members from the Urban County Council, at least 1 homeless or formerly homeless individual. Each of the remaining members must include representatives from relevant organizations, projects, such as persons with substance abuse disorders, persons with HIV/AIDS, veterans, the chronically homeless, families with children, unaccompanied youth, the seriously mentally ill, and victims of intimate partner violence.
So we have some, the way it's written, we have some leeway as to, we don't always have to have one of those particular subpopulations present on the board, but we have kind of like certain categories that we always have to have representation from.
So, just food for thought, I'm not vested either way, quite honestly, but if the board is going to need to be made up by specific populations, right, or representation, to make sure that every group is somewhat represented by voice, the rolling off, it seems a little, is that because of city statute or city ordinance or whatever with the board? Because, if you switch, nothing against, like if we move to Diane, you're losing 6 years of institutional kind of understanding about this board and how it works and how it doesn't work and the committees and all that, and somebody has to start all over again. Not that I'm not saying that, I'm just using that for an example, right? So what's the forced having to roll off if you're going to have to still keep and in my situation it'd be domestic violence people. I'm happy to roll off, that's not what I mean. But I'm just trying to think of the fluidity of a board and the knowledge that comes with it. With new board members, it gets, it took me 2 years to figure out what was going on. I don't know about you all. I mean, it's like, wow. So I'm just curious.
So
if there's a chance for it to change, or would it change, or should it not?
I know that presently it is included in our governance. What I would have to research and go back to is the ordinance itself, because I imagine it's probably also in the ordinance.
Yeah, you can ask Charlie too.
It is.
He
wrote
it.
He wrote it.
Maximum of 2 consecutive 4-year terms.
Wow, it's been 8 years. You go off,
So, with that in mind, we have the power to control our COC governance. We don't have the power without changing the ordinance to overrule that aspect when it comes to the HPI board itself. And so that may have been also a consideration. I don't know what Polly's full thought process was, but maybe she also had ideals about there might be.
Now Charlie put that in there originally.
Yeah.
And it may be a city thing that on any commission you can only serve 2 terms or something, you know.
That's what I wondered. Is it more of a city ordinance? I just, if it's based on agency, it doesn't seem
It doesn't
always
say agency,
feasible
it
to.
says a group of people, which happens to be your agency.
It just so happens we're the only ones serving DV in that way. So then it's agency. It just doesn't always seem feasible to change. But
I'm glad to do some more homework on it and figure out what our options are moving forward. Because I can see pros and cons to term limits. You know, obviously, sometimes we don't want only the same voices at the table, but there's also the flip side that you're clearly speaking to, which is, you know, you only have so many people within your organization that I think are probably going to be prepared to step into the role. It takes preparation time, it takes that learning curve. So I definitely can acknowledge both aspects.
well, some boards it's based on your agency, and it depends on who the CEO wants to name to represent that board, right? Because you kind of always have a seat at the table. That doesn't sound like this is where HPI is. It wouldn't always, but it could be, only just because of the nature of who we are versus maybe other homeless providers. So, yeah, I'm good. I was just curious to figure out what we're doing.
That's exactly what I need from everybody.
Yeah.
I mean, I was involved in the office for 4 years, but I took a break. I came back. I'm in a different role. There's a lot of things that are familiar to me, but there's also things that are new to me and things that I'm learning. And I need everybody's voice. I need everybody's questions, their ideals. I'm not sold on just doing things the way that we've done it because it's what we've done before or what somebody suggested. So I totally want exactly what you're throwing out.
Just curious. Yeah, thanks.
And these are the reasons why I wanted to kind of hit the brake a minute and kind of open it up, have a broader conversation, do some additional research. We need to do what's right for the Lexington homelessness continuum of care, and that takes a little bit of doing and a little bit of time. Other discussion on the executive committee? All right, Marissa gets to take a turn next with permanent supportive housing standards.
Okay, so I know that we already discussed those emergency shelter standards. And as I stated previously, those rapid rehousing standards had already been approved and are standards that are set by the COC. It is my understanding, based upon the dates of the document when it was revised, that the permanent supportive housing program standards had begun. Those discussions had begun. That is something that was well underway in revising those standards in that document. However, it was not brought to completion. So unlike the emergency shelter standards, we would not be starting from the very beginning, but rather going off of the document that had been previously revised, reviewing that document, similar to the emergency shelter standards, meeting, coming together, discussing if those standards need to be amended, changed, altered, etc. As such, I will need individuals from permanent housing projects to be on this work group and to discuss with me what those standards look like. That way we can work back and forth and then bring that here to be approved by committee and the COC at large.
I'm going to pick on Christina for a second.
Say, I'll volunteer because I remember we had a lot of notes.
Yeah. So, correct me if I'm wrong. I think when we were trying to develop the permanent supportive housing standards, that it always went through this committee as a whole, and we did not do a separate work group just specifically for the PSH providers.
That is my recommendation.
Okay. My thought process, and I feel free to disagree. My thought process is, again, like I stated before, when it comes to emergency shelter, there are a lot of details, a lot of specific questions, a lot of very specific to PSH provider items that need to be ironed out. I recommend that we move that to a work group, establish what we consider to be a votable draft, and then bring it back to the committee as a whole, and we can solicit feedback from the entire committee. But I just think where we're talking about something that is so highly specialized, it is an impediment to the development of that document to try to really do that work as an entire committee until we are at a certain point in our progress. But again, I'm open. That would be my recommendation.
I, of course, am fine with that recommendation. If there's no objection, then if there are any anyone else who would like to be a part of the permanent supportive housing work group. If not, then you will be receiving an email from me.
So I know that you might not be prepared to make a commitment, but you guys are now operating PSH as well. So you might want to go back and talk to your organization and see if you guys would want to have a seat at the table. So that would be a document that would definitely impact you all. I think those are probably our only two PSH providers that are here today, so we'll have some follow-up discussions. But is there anybody opposed to moving that to a separate work group for the time being?
Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
Then last on our old business agenda is the subject of IDs for those experiencing homelessness. I know that there was some legislation that was in progress that would potentially solve some of the problems that we have with being able to directly pay the county clerk's office, and then of course the IDs moved to being handled outside of the county clerk's office. So as far as I know, that legislation is still in progress and has not actually come to fruition. So I unfortunately don't have, my update is no update. We're the same place that we were. I'm going to revisit it. I know that this continues to be a barrier for our population, and I know during COVID it got much worse because of appointment schedules and sometimes having to physically go to Frankfurt in order to try to obtain IDs. So we're going to continue to move forward on that. We have some additional research to do to find out the details of where we're at and what the next steps would be for us as a group to try to contribute to that movement. So at this time, I'd like to open it up to public sharing and announcements, if anybody would have anything to share with the group.
Did we skip the racial equity analysis in Encampment?
Oh.
I was just about to ask you to put that in.
I'm sorry, I straight up did. So you can go ahead.
Okay, so the racial equity analysis update, you all may be aware and hopefully did receive a survey that went out from Cloudburst. They are the group that is doing our equity analysis for our COC. I believe that survey link is still live, so you could still complete that survey. However, I know that Cloudburst has transitioned into requesting one-on-one interviews, and I personally have received a couple of emails and phone calls from individuals asking about those one-on-one interviews. Please feel free, if you have time and are able to and have capacity, to engage with Cloudburst. It will be really helpful so that we can better serve individuals who are experiencing homelessness and prioritize equity, something that both the unsheltered NOFO and the COC Competition have emphasized as HUD priorities is equity, and I don't expect that to change moving forward. So all of your feedback to Cloudburst will be really, really beneficial in ensuring that we are moving forward through an equitable lens, as well as doing what is best for our continuum. So I really encourage you to complete that survey and be a part of those one-on-one interviews as they happen. Are there any questions about that or anything? Okay, wonderful.
Also skipped over encampment SOP updates. To my knowledge, that was already handled. There was, I think, a vote just to change some of the language to reflect things like the new creation of the Housing Advocacy and Community Development Division, and Charlie being the commissioner. But I think that was only just changes around people's titles. Is there presently any desire to make additional changes or updates to that document, that we need to keep this on the agenda for the time being? All right, then we'll go back to public sharing. Any announcements for the group?
I have something. I was just wondering, do we have a plan for winter care coming forward? Because it's going to get cold before we know it.
Yeah. So traditionally, we usually start that around the end of August. I already have it on my to-do list. Just being fully transparent, still doing duties for both grants management and the Office of Homelessness. And it sounds like I'm going to be doing that for a few more weeks. I'm going to try to at least get us a meeting scheduled, send out something by the end of the month, because I know it is important that we have those conversations as we move forward. I think, obviously we've done some things differently the last couple of years, but some of the funding opportunities that we had in order to implement, it's not present anymore. So we're going to have to kind of return to some of our previous practices and revisit the discussion of how we are going to plan to get through the winter. So expect that to go out by the end of the month. And I'll make sure to send that out to the entire listserv, but I would in particular really encourage folks that have involvement with our emergency shelters, with our street outreach teams, that kind of are the ones to first receive our population. Other announcements, questions? I shared it by email earlier today, but also there's some information that you should have an email about New Life Day Center kind of expanding their medical clinic. They're now doing that 5 days a week. It can be walk-in or appointment. If it's walk-in, you should definitely encourage folks to get there early in the morning. And they're working on a plan to hopefully soon be able to also provide 5 days a week mental health care access. And for their medical side, they do have a prescriber that's there daily. They take insurance, but will also work with individuals without insurance.
One other question about the, because my term ends also, but I know it takes a little while to get somebody reappointed. Do board members continue to serve, or did they go off at the end of the term? Do you know the answer to that?
I would have to research that one. That's one that I didn't really have much of a role in previously.
Yeah, I don't know.
I'll follow up with you and Darlene both quickly so we can kind of plan for those next steps.
I think I'll add too, just since this is the advocacy committee, which I brought up, Jackie and I talked about at our partner performance, that there's been a significant number of properties and landlords in Lexington that have stopped taking housing choice vouchers, have stopped working with programs, and our PSH programs are really taking a hit and have really struggling to find places just willing to work with anything, given FMR waivers.
Louisville has an ordinance about that, don't they?
What's that?
I believe Louisville has an ordinance about that.
So yeah,
The-
they
the
have
inability
like
to
a
do
income
that, yeah.
discrimination ordinance, and that's something that I think we need to probably take a look at. I know I need to get more fully acquainted with what actually their policies are and how it works, but that would be one thing that I think would be helpful. We're gonna have to probably look for any strategies that we have, but also something else I'll put on the table is Community Action Council had through our Continuum of Care program, housing navigation services that were funded and no longer have that funding. So at this point, I don't have a dedicated housing navigation service or anyone performing really landlord recruitment activities on behalf of the COC. We've already allocated all of our funding for fiscal year 23 out of Innovative and Sustainable Solutions Fund. But if we want to look ahead to fiscal year 24, if we want to seek out other potential options, I have one other idea about looking. The benefit of being in grants presently is that I know where all our grant dollars are, and I think there might potentially be some dollars that I can explore. I think we have some CDBG dollars that had been allocated for a particular project that didn't end up going under agreement. So I'm going to see if that's maybe a viable option for us. But any ideals that we have, I think that maybe is something that this group should think about. It is, as Christina points out, getting more difficult, and I think we're going to need someone really dedicated to that. Now, LFUCG did hire a housing advocate, but that position's a little bit broader than just landlord recruitment. For example, they would also be a point of contact for folks that have code enforcement violations, that need repairs to their homes, helping them navigate some of those processes and resources. So that position is, as one person, is not going to be able to do all of their duties and also be like extremely dedicated to our population and our providers in doing landlord recruitment. So I'm open to those ideals that anybody would have. As a reminder, we currently have a COC competition underway, 2 of them in fact. That unsheltered NOFO does offer supportive services for coordinated entry, supportive services street outreach, or supportive services standalone. So an organization could choose to write an application to do that work, and that opportunity is currently available. Definitely open to ideas, but my concern is, to me, that's a gap that we need to figure out a solution for. I'm trying to have some conversations internally at LFUCG to see if that's something that maybe some other departments and divisions might want to partner with OP, and it maybe not be solely my issue. But I also have to have a backup plan for if I can't find the dollars within LFUCG, where are we going to get them? So keep that in your brains. Help me figure it out. Other announcements? Questions?
Any updates on the waiver requests?
So actually, yes, they're sending out some information separately for our COC and our ESG waivers. We did get word back on ESG today. Still looking into some of the language, because it looks like you won't be able to use it for your Emergency Solutions 2021 funds. But I think that we have been approved for the FMR waiver and a couple of the other waivers that are available for ESG for your 22 funds. I think you all are a little bit further behind in spending than Arbor, but I think Arbor would probably be able to start utilizing those waivers very soon. We're still waiting to hear back on the COC waivers. I think they got Christina's hopes up because they had her copied on the email, but it was only the follow-up to our ESG request, which, by the way, HUD offers those waivers, but makes it extremely difficult. We applied for those waivers 3 times, and every time there was a new thing we had to do, or something that we had failed to include or an additional step. So I'm actually really surprised to hear that we're being granted some of the waivers. But I'll have an update for you very soon. We just got that while I was in the dentist chair. If there's nothing else, is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
We're gonna get our motions in before we go off the board.